Hello, everybody, and welcome to Conversations with Authors. Today, we bring to you Midterm Elections 2022, a special book passage panel moderated by Paula Farmer. I am Nick, your producer for the day. Before we get to our authors and speakers properly, please allow me to welcome you to Book Passages Conversations with Authors. If you've seen one of these events before, well then, welcome back. But if you are new here, then Book Passage is an independently run bookstore out of the San Francisco Bay Area, and we host and run talks just like these quite often throughout the week. As we are now streaming on YouTube and will continue to do so in the future, please consider subscribing by clicking the subscribe button just below the video. If you'd like to check out our upcoming events, or like the idea of an email newsletter even more, or better yet, would like to look at any of our speakers' books, or would like to interact with any of our speakers' campaigns, you can find it using the links in the description below or at bookpassage.com. Now, allow me to introduce our moderator for the day, Paula Farmer. Paula curates and moderates special programming for social justice discourse for Book Passage and a number of other clients. She's also the creator and host of Speaking Of, an interview series on Instagram in which she talks to BIPOC authors, artists, and activists on topical issues. She is co-founder and chairperson of the Mosaic Committee for the California Independent Booksellers Association, and in 2021 was selected for the DEI Committee on behalf of the American Booksellers Association. It is lovely to have everybody here today, but Paula will be the one to introduce you to the rest of our speakers for the day. Paula?
Thank you so much, Nick, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining for another panel event that I've curated on behalf of Book Passage, and I think I've gotten just fantastic group of people for today's discussion. Over the past 2 years, a culmination of many America's greatest fears have come to fruition. A public health crisis, the loss of reproductive freedom, attacks on LGBTQ+ rights, a looming recession, the weakening of voter rights, and outright increase of voter suppression. All of that can either turn off or motivate people to vote this fall. But it's true what they say, the 2022 midterm elections really are consequential, especially when extremism on the right is on the rise and there is so much political division in our country. In other words, this is no time for apathy, and I know my panelists agree with that. I would like to introduce you now to the wonderful array of panelists, starting with Carol Anderson. Carol Anderson is the Charles Howard Candler Professor of African American Studies at Emory University and author of the New York Times bestseller and National Book Circle Critics Circle Award winner, White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide. She is also the author of One Person, No Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy, which was longlisted for the National Book Award in nonfiction. Also joining us is Professor Josh Douglas of the University of Kentucky J. David Rosenberg College of Law. He is the Ashland Spears Incorporated Distinguished Research Professor of Law. He teaches and researches election law and judicial decision-making. He is the author of Vote for Us, How to Take Back Our Elections and Change the Future of Voting. This is a book that provides hope and inspiration for a positive path for voting rights. Also on the panel is Anita Gail Jones, a friend and a fellow book club member and a grassroots advocate in this area. Anita lives in the San Francisco Bay Area, but was born in Albany, Georgia, and maintains a strong connection to her home state. In fact, that connection, among other things, inspired her to get involved with Georgia's changing and volatile political landscape. She recently launched Anita's Peach Corps to enlist Bay Area residents to help her home state send 2020 Democratic candidates to the U.S. Senate through grassroots efforts. And she is doing it again for the 2022 midterm elections. With that, please welcome Anita, Carol, and Josh to the Book Passage virtual stage. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us for this vital discussion during this important time. And I want to start off with Carol. One Person, No Vote focuses a lot on the issue of voter suppression, especially as it pertains to Black voters and other marginalized groups. Can you briefly tell us more about the themes of that book, the research that was involved in getting to the book, and what does voter suppression specifically and practically look like today as we're, 3 weeks away from midterm elections?
So what got me onto this book was the 2016 election, when the pundits were saying, "Ooh, well, Black folks just didn't show up, because they just couldn't fill Hillary. They just weren't filling Hillary. So Black folks just didn't vote." Well, this was the first presidential election in 50 years without the protection of the Voting Rights Act. And so by ignoring that key variable and the way that these states had implemented things like voter ID, like closing down polling places, particularly in Black and poor communities, by massive voter roll purges, it ignored then that Black voter turnout went down by 7%. But maybe it has something to do with the lack of protections of the Voting Rights Act that made that possible. And so I set out to figure out what voter suppression really looks like. And what I saw was that you had a historic language that we see even today of wrapping oneself in the flag and in protecting democracy, protecting election integrity, while systematically yelling voter fraud without having any evidence of massive systemic voter fraud, but using that voter fraud that is identified as coming out of Black and marginalized communities as the reason to set up these massive barriers. So I look historically from the poll tax and the literacy test to current day to voter ID laws that seem really generic and just innocuous, but are actually quite lethal, to poll closures and extreme partisan gerrymandering. Those methods are designed to silence or dilute the votes of American citizens.
Yeah, I mean, definitely we've been seeing it. I feel like it's obviously been going on historically for a long time, but it seemed to be very pronounced, or we were maybe more aware of it since the election of Trump. How bad is voter suppression since, let's say, the last midterm elections, Carol? And have things gotten worse, stayed the same, or are we seeing improvements? I know we don't have the John Lewis Voting Act, voted, so that seems problematic. But I'm just wondering, have you noticed, you mentioned 2016, but I'm wondering, what did you see in 2018?
So what I saw in 2018, I'll take Georgia. What we saw in 2018 is that you had a Secretary of State who was running for governor. And so you started seeing the kind of machinations coming in. So originally there was a massive voter roll purge that removed over 500,000 voters from the rolls. And then in October of 2018, on the last day of voter registration, he removed, using a thing called exact match, removed 53,000 voters from the rolls. And fewer than 10% of those voters were white. On the last day of voter registration, right before the November election. But what we're seeing after the 2020 election, where you had, in the midst of COVID, massive turnout. And I was saying to my colleagues here that in the Senate runoff that flipped the Senate, you had Black voter turnout of 92%. That is just like, wow. But you didn't see the embrace from the politicians of that massive commitment to democracy. Instead, you saw a voter suppression law that removed what they call drop boxes. And what that meant then is that they came up with a formula to make it look like they were being equitable so that everybody got the drop box in every county. But what it did was, in the Atlanta area, it removed, there were over 100 drop boxes in the 2020 election. Now at the Atlanta area is down to something like 22 or 23 drop boxes. And not only removing the drop boxes, but limiting when they're available. So like only during early voting period and only inside the building. They used to be outside under 24/7 surveillance, so video surveillance, so that people who were working late could come and drop off their ballot. Now it's early voting period within the building. When the building closes, you can't get to the drop box. I mean, so it is shutting off this kind of access under the guise of election integrity, although no one could point to any drop box being tampered with. I mean, that's so important to understand. So the rules of election integrity and protecting the sanctity of the ballot box and ensuring that there's not massive rampant voter fraud. They can't document the massive rampant voter fraud to justify the massive obstacles that they're putting in place. So, but it works because the ruse of voter fraud, the big lie, the big lie, the big lie is really powerful.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you for those stats. I don't think I had a handle on those stats and the importance of the voter box that you're talking about, and the access to it. Josh, I want to bring you in because as I mentioned in the intro, I hosted you when Vote for Us came out. And I found it to be very inspiring because the focus, I mean, you're very academic, Josh, and I think anyone would expect something very more along those lines, more academic, but it was actually very pragmatic, focus on grassroots and how we really, people are always wanting to know, how can I make a difference? Does my vote matter? And I felt like your book, Vote for Us, really kind of hammered that home. It really brought that home as far as the importance of grassroots, every election, local, regional, national. With that, I would love you to talk more about Vote for Us, your research for that book, and how you've been, maybe give us an example from the book of how you do see changes on different levels and how it matters.
Sure, thank you, and thank you so much for including me in just an incredible panel with three remarkable women who I'm already learning so much. So I appreciate you having me here. And I hope everyone watching this goes and reads Carol's book first, because it's an incredible book that sets the stage for all the problems that are really rampant within our democracy, but also I think tells the backstory for why my book hopefully brings us out of the despair. I mean, I have to admit, Carol's book, when I read it, Carol, I mean, I've learned so much and it's so well done, and yet I was kind of depressed because of all of the ways that we're suppressing the vote, and particularly among marginalized communities and people who we've historically discriminated against. It's such a absurdity for someone like Chief Justice Roberts of the Supreme Court to say that things have changed in the South, and so therefore racism is essentially the thing of the past. Your book explains how that is just wrong. It's just demonstrably wrong. And then I hope, if you are feeling despair like I was a little bit after reading Carol's book, that you pick up my book, because I try to offer a path forward. So much of what we talk about in discussing the right to vote is doom and gloom. When I was actually writing this book and looking for a publisher, I got a lot of rejections because they said it's really well written and we love the stories, but doom and gloom sells, and your book is the anti-doom and gloom. And that actually kind of made me double down into wanting to write a book that was a positive book about the right to vote. And I appreciate, Paula, what you said about the readability of it, because I worked really hard. I think it's right that as a law professor, I sort of have the cards stacked against me when I tell someone I wrote a book for the general public, and they figure, well, it's going to be full of legalese and arcane principles. And my goal, because this area is so important, that democracy is the foundation of everything else that we do in our society, that I worked really hard to try to write a book that was going to be as readable as possible. And I did that through stories. I mean, that's what animates the book, is stories of amazing individuals. I tell people I wrote a positive book about voting rights, and they assume it's just a page long. What's there to say that's good news? I did actually write a whole book, and it's because I found all of these incredible stories. So you asked how I researched, or kind of what my process was. Well, I had learned through my my studies of election law and the right to vote, I knew about a bunch of good news reforms happening in some places. A lot of places were suppressing the right to vote, but a lot of places were actually making it easier for people to participate, trying to expand the electorate, to make our elections more inclusive, more democratic, more convenient. And I wanted to know, both what were those good news stories, because I needed some positivity, and then who was behind them? How did we make it that we actually got some good news in voting rights? And there are tons of stories in the book, and it was so much fun to profile people. I refer to them as democracy champions, everyday people on the ground who are making our elections better. And so, you asked for a story. I'll tell you the story of how I opened the book, because I think it goes a little bit to what Carol talked about. One of the terrible vestiges of history that we still have in many places is the practice of felon disenfranchisement, where we take away the right to vote to individuals convicted of a felony. And it won't surprise anyone that these laws disproportionately fall on minority communities because of the structural racism that infects our criminal justice system. In Kentucky, where I live and work, is one of the worst states, because we have a law like a couple other states, Iowa, Florida, Virginia, where the laws were on the book, that took away the right to vote for life. And an individual that I met named West Powell was someone who had lost the right to vote. When he was a teenager, about 17 or 18, he and his brother broke into a junkyard and stole like an old car radio, and he was caught. He was convicted. Initially, he got probation, but then he was caught violating his probation because he was out coming home from work on the third shift. The only job he could find was one late at night, and that technically was outside of his curfew. So he went to jail for about 9 months, convicted of a felony. And he got out of jail, and he sort of thought, what am I doing with myself? Like, this isn't who I am. And so he said, I'm going to change my life. So he cleaned up his act. He decided to go back to school. He learned computers, opened up his own computer repair shop to repair people's computers, met a woman and got married. They ended up having 5 kids, and was really a member of his community. This is in northern Kentucky, outside of south of Cincinnati. But as he told me, he still didn't have the fundamental thing that make us all equal, which is the right to vote. So at the time, the Kentucky legislature was considering a bill to make it easier for some low-level individuals with low-level felonies to regain their voting rights back. So we went to testify before the legislative committee that was hearing this. And he told his story. He spoke for about 4 minutes, very soft-spoken. He kind of a big teddy bear of a guy, very soft-spoken. And he said, my name is Wes Powell, and here's my story, and I've got these little girls, but I'm not an equal as you because I don't have the right to vote. And on the committee that day, the state politician was several people, including one named Whitney Westerfield, a Republican, who said he was opposed to any changes to the felon disenfranchisement law. He said that, they did their crime. They decided they didn't want to be a part of society, so they shouldn't get to vote like everybody. But then he heard Wes Powell's story, and he sort of just put himself in Wes' shoes and said, you know what, that's right. What else are we asking anybody to do who committed a crime but do exactly what Wes Powell did? So he started texting his fellow Republicans and said, we got to get this done for West and so many people like him. And they did. And Kentucky passed a law that made it a lot easier for people with felony convictions to regain the right to vote back, all because Wes Powell spoke up and told his story. And so I call Wes a democracy champion. And to me, the kicker, the best part of this is he brought his kids with him when he went to vote for the very first time. And he was brought to tears at how meaningful it was. And the book is chock full of stories like that, people telling their own stories and explaining why the right to vote is so meaningful to them.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Yeah, I remember, and I think you pointed that out when you were at Book Passage in real life, as they say, IRL, and I was moved by that story then, and it still means so much today. I think maybe if you had written your book a little later, our other panelist, our next panelist that I'm about to bring into the discussion, Anita, Gail Jones, I think she might have been profiled but I'm going to let Anita tell her story about how you got involved, Anita, in getting other people involved in voter engagement or combating voter suppression in Georgia, specifically your hometown. And you really rallied the troops in where you currently live in California, in the Bay Area, but felt very close to what was happening in your home state. So I was hoping you could kind of share a little bit more about how you started Anita's Peach Corps.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I don't think Josh would have wanted to waste his precious pages on me because I don't think my story is that grand. But I did not know, first of all, I have to say, I did not know this is what I was doing when we started. We started in 2020. I was on the phone with a friend of mine who lives in Texas who had done a lot of work with Obama's campaign. And she knew about runoffs. I wasn't really familiar with runoffs and just what kind of an animal that is. And she knew a lot about it. And I was just explaining to her that because I'm here in California, Northern California, where so many people have never set foot in Georgia, number one, and they think it's just this weird thing way across the country, they were all looking to me, the only Georgian they knew, as to what to do now that Georgia is on everybody's mind because of the race between Warnock and Loeffler, mainly, Kelly Loeffler. So I said, I don't know what to do. I'm not that political. I vote and everything, and Georgia is on my mind too, but it's still way over there across the country. So she said, if you got some people that are interested, well, let's jump on a Zoom and I can explain what a runoff is and maybe we can figure something out. So we did that. And before I ended the conversation with her that day, we had come up with this name, Anita's Peach Corps, which we kind of ran with that. We had a Zoom. I invited my dear friend, Rutha Harris, who is one of the original freedom singers, still lives in Albany, Georgia. I invited Rutha to come on and do a song for us. And so my friend in Texas says, well, you don't have a Zoom meeting now. Now you have a rally. I said, oh, okay, we have a rally. So after that Zoom meeting, we were off and running. I tell you, the plane was being built as we ran down, as it went down the runway, because we decided to do postcards. I had been doing postcards already, and I thought I like postcards because they're not as invasive as phone calls or texts. They're very personal, and they can be beautiful. And maybe you'll put them on your refrigerator if you like them enough. So my husband, who is a graphic designer, designed a beautiful postcard. We printed up 5,000 of them. And we got this team together from California to Georgia. It ended up involving 8 states and having my friend Judy, we call her Judy Kornacki because she can do those graphs and things
Graphs
like
and charts, yeah.
She puts together those things. So she really was a driving force in it because she understood the nature of runoffs and she really explained things to us, and we got people writing, and next thing we knew, we had done 5,000 cards and postcards. We'd done 3,000 phone calls. We raised $2,000 to send to one of the Democratic committees in Leesburg, Georgia. You'll know where that is, Miss Carol. Leesburg, one of the reddest counties in Georgia. And we were working hand in hand with those folks on the ground there. And it made a difference. It made a difference. We got a list because we focused, and I think this was key, we focused on Southwest Georgia, where I'm from. A lot of little towns where people are very, very suppressed and they don't get a lot of attention. And we were writing directly into those counties, in those little towns. And I was just blown away with the results. And we really felt we helped to move the needle with those 5,000 cards targeted in that little area. So here comes 2022, and guess what? We have to re-elect Warnock. And so we did it again. My husband designed this beautiful little postcard, and we got the quote on the front is from Representative Lewis. It says, "Your vote is the most powerful nonviolent tool we have to create a more perfect union." And this time we decided to double our efforts. We printed up 10,000 cards, and we are close to doing it. We have only about 856 more cards to do.
Yeah.
Complete the 10,000. I think we're going to go a little bit above it, actually, because I've got some high school students here in Marin County that want to write. I just sent a kid off to my cousin in Atlanta that she's got some people that are writing. It's just been kind of amazing to run and keep up with
Yeah.
Anita's people.
But I think, Anita, the sense I get from you, and I participated in the postcard thing, by the way, I have about 50 more to do. I know, I promise. But I think not only is it good for the people that you're sending it to, because name recognition makes a difference in voting, which I think Josh and Carol would also agree with. But also making those voters feeling noticed and appreciated and needed. But honestly, for those of us that were involved in the campaign, you felt like you were doing something, and especially when you're in a county or an area that tends to go a certain way anyway,
Right.
you feel like you want to help, get in the trenches elsewhere.
Yeah.
And obviously in 2020, we couldn't go, we couldn't fly and boots on the ground type of thing. So it was a really good way to help out and feel as if you're a little bit a part of the process. And I think that's a lot about what Josh's book is about, and why I said I think someone like yourself or the people involved in the campaign could easily be pointed out in it as well, because it's those little things that you think aren't making a difference, but they do. And like you said, you could move the needle a little bit. But at the bottom line is people feel like they're engaging in the process and they're helping other people engage in the process. Josh, I want to know, midterm elections historically have had low voter turnout, and this is for Carol too, especially among younger voters. And we're kind of concerned about that leading up to less than 3 weeks from now. Can you explain why that typically is and how we can make a difference among younger voters? Because not only do we need their vote now, but we need them to kind of get into a pattern of voting.
Yeah. Well, first, let me just say, Anita, I hope you'll let me write about you in the update to Vote for Us whenever I have a chance to write an update, because no, your story is the exact sort of thing that makes our democracy tick, right? That people engaging, that's what democracy is all about. And it's at least what it should be about. It's not about from the top down where the politicians get to decide who leads us. It should be from the bottom up. And so I applaud you for your efforts in trying to get more people to vote, because ultimately, regardless of who is elected, we should all want high voter turnout to get the best representation. Our Declaration of Independence says that a government is legitimate based on the consent of the governed. And in my view, that should mean all of us, not just a subset, because we figured out how to get some people to vote more often, and more importantly, or more devastatingly, we figured out how to get some people not to vote to make it harder for them. So Paul, onto your question specifically about young voters, I think there's multiple causes for why young people are not engaged. And some of it is sort of a cyclical, self-serving, where because young people have historically low turnout, the politicians and campaigns don't focus on young people. They focus their efforts on where you're going to get higher turnout, which means then the young people don't turn out, and it's a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's part of it. I also think that we don't do a very good job of engaging young people in a systematic way when they become eligible voters, because becoming eligible at 18 is a really odd time for someone to start the new habit of voting. And what political science studies tell us is that one of the best predictors of whether someone's going to vote is whether they voted previously. Voting is habit forming. And if you skip the first election when you're an eligible voter, you're much less likely to vote in the next election. Non-voting is a habit as well. And 18 is a really odd time to do that because, you know, you're graduating, hopefully you're graduating high school, you're moving out, you're going to college or going to community college or entering the workforce. And then we place all these hurdles. So you've got to register. In many states, you have to find the right kind of ID. In states like Texas, your student ID won't count as an ID. So even if you're a student at a state university, you can't use that ID. And so we just make it hard. We put all these hurdles up on 18-year-olds. And then, you know, we act surprised when they don't show up to vote. Of course, and then there's, of course, you know, where we locate polling places, where, you know, in a lot of places there's fights about having polling places on college campuses, and the closing down of polling places in historically Black university colleges, universities. So we see all of this stuff, right, that affects young people. So one of the things that I've been really intrigued by, and I've started to, I've been researching for several years now, is lowering the voting age to 16, at least for local elections, which some places have done. There's about half dozen cities in America that young people, 16 and 17-year-olds, can vote in their local elections or their school board elections. In fact, San Francisco had a proposition on the ballot now twice, and it just barely lost in 2020. And so I suspect the proponents are going to put it back on the ballot again. And I think there's a lot of promise for lowering the voting age to 16, at least for local or school board elections. And we can debate some of these issues if you'd like. But the biggest to me is that this is where we can get people engaged in democracy at a time when we know where they are, so we can get them registered. We can educate them properly. We desperately need to improve civics education as part of this, and create a habit where people regularly vote. That's just what you do. And so I think one potential reform, and as a long-term horizon, is to really look seriously at lowering the voting age for local elections as a mechanism as well. And by the way, the places that have done this, places like Tacoma Park, Maryland, 16 and 17-year-olds typically vote at about twice the level as 18 to 24-year-olds. So it really has had some tangible results as well.
Well, that's interesting. I didn't even know that about San Francisco, that there was, I feel like that the argument against it has always been something to the effect of, well, then they're not responsible enough and they're just going to vote the way their parents vote, which, you know.
That was the same argument made about women before the ratification of the 19th Amendment. They're just going to vote however their husbands. I find that really patronizing and offensive, frankly. And you know, anyone who's been around a teenager, do you think their parents are going to be able to tell them what to do and how they should vote? There's a handful of countries that have done this, including Scotland. And there's a really interesting study in Scotland that looked at the voting habits of 16 to 17-year-olds versus their parents. And it showed that 16 to 17-year-olds voted the same way as their parents. I forget the number, but it's somewhere around 60% of the time, which is kind of shocking. You know, you'd think it would be close to 100% of the time if their theory is that you'd vote the same as your parents. 50% would be it's a toss-up. And you know, they voted only about, I think it was about 60-ish% of the time they were the same as their parents, which I think just proves the point that that's a really poor argument against it.
Carol, you want to weigh in on this?
I'm going to come in with the doom and gloom again. But it is that North Carolina had where you were pre-registered in high school to vote because they knew that voting is a habit, and it was part of civics education. And when the Republicans came to power after the 2010 election, that was one of the first things they got rid of. They knew that it worked. And so part of what we're dealing with here is a structure that's in power that doesn't want this broader, vibrant democracy. And we have to acknowledge that. And I think about Paul Weyrich, who was the co-founder of the Heritage Foundation. And in 1980 or so, he gave a talk where he said, you know, all of you are goo-goos because you believe in good government. You want everybody to vote. Well, I don't want everybody to vote because quite candidly, our leverage goes up as the voting population goes down. So when we understand that part of what we're dealing with here, because part of what you hear about lower youth turnout is that, oh, they don't care, they're apathetic. It means that we have put structures in place to keep the voting populace down, to make it harder for them to vote, to dissuade them from voting. And so part of what happened in the 2018 election is that the youth vote actually doubled from what it was in 2016, because there was active grassroots mobilization and organizing targeted at the youth vote that made it very clear why their vote was so important. We saw that rise again in the 2020 election, where again, that kind of engagement, and I'm still seeing that kind of mobilization targeted at the youth to make sure that the leverage does not go up as the voting populace goes down, but in fact, to have that. What I tell my students is that they are the largest demographic in the United States. If they voted at the same level as the baby boomers, it would transform this nation. And hearing, and I say, so you don't cede your power, CEDE. You don't cede your power. You wield that power for good. You wield that power to make democracy work. And they engage. After the 2020 general election, when we were going into the runoff, and I was teaching a class called Voting Rights and Voter Suppression, my students came to me after the general election and went, oh my God, we've got a runoff. This runoff is going to be huge. Is it possible for us to register folks to vote who weren't registered for the general election, if we get them registered in time enough before the runoff? And I said, check with the general counsel, but I think the answer is yes. And my students mobilized, organized, found out you could do it, and started registering folks to vote. So one of the things that you see in this new voter suppression legislation was to limit the time between the general election and the runoff, which therefore limited the time that folks could be registered to vote who weren't registered for the general election. And there you had folks who were turning 18 in that period of time. You had folks who weren't registered first, but now we're like, oh my God, I see what this means. And so part of what we have to be cognizant of, grassroots makes the difference. It is that organizing that you're talking about, Josh, and that organizing that you've done, Anita, that is the transformative power in this democracy. We just have to be cognizant that there is Darth Vader out there, welcome to the dark side, Luke, who is really, really trying to figure out every time we have this mass mobilization, figuring out how to shut it down. And so that's why I do have a chapter in One Person, No Vote called We Will Warrior Up. And I got that from a quote from some indigenous folk who in North Dakota, where that state legislature had decided to require physical addresses on the voter ID. 61% of that state's population who are indigenous, they live on reservations. And reservations don't have physical addresses. And so that's how you're able to wipe out 61% of the folk. And so what they did was they said, we will warrior up. They got Google GPS pieces. They got portable printers. They started printing up tribal IDs that then were creating physical addresses where folks lived on those reservations. They're like, we're not having it. And that's part of the thing about this quest for democracy, this hunger for democracy, this fight for democracy. Every time Darth Vader does this way, you see a lightsaber come up. Folks aren't playing. And we've got to keep that fire, that determination to know that this isn't a one-shot deal. This isn't just about voting in 2016 or 2018 or 2020. It is making it a habit. The price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And that's what we have to know about in this fight for democracy. And that's what the youth are getting. You're seeing that mobilizing when you're looking at the Dobbs decision, when you're seeing climate change. And I mean, you saw what 90% of the snow crabs had disappeared from Alaska. And so they're not even having a snow crab harvest. That's climate change. It's knowing that and being willing to say, we have the power to stop this, to influence this, and we're going to wield that power.
I love that story. I love that. I have to tell you the story. I just came back from Georgia about a week ago, and your democracy champions, Josh, and warring up. This was a beautiful moment. My favorite moment of the 2-week trip. I stopped at a roadside farm stand in Sasser, Georgia, and there was this 80-year-old Black woman that was sitting there shucking peanuts. Now that means separating the peanuts from the plant. That's shucking peanuts. Her hands are all covered in dust. And being the person I am, I strike up a conversation with her and we talk. And she's very gruff at first, and almost don't want to talk to you. But then later on, I had her laughing and we're talking. And she said, if you were around here for much longer, I wouldn't get any work done because we'd just be laughing and laughing. You just make me laugh. So I came back to see her a few days later, and I was talking about voting. She said, oh, I vote. Oh yeah, I vote. You want to see my card? She got up from her chair, went over to her purse and dug in there and brought out her voter ID card. And I tell you, the pride on her face at having a voter ID card and casting her vote, it just filled me. I just talk about a warrior. And this woman is 80 years old in the Deep South. She's seen some stuff. She still does. And she's sitting there shucking peanuts, but she's got her card.
Yeah. So in 2018, I signed up to drive folks to the polls because Georgia has shut down over 200 polling places. So these grassroots organizations had set up basically these driver systems where you put your name in where you are, the length of time where you can drive somebody to and from the polls. And then they also then found the people who wanted to vote but needed a ride to the polls. And I mean, so this is that grassroots work. And so I ended up driving some elderly Black women. And one woman who voted talked about, as she was handing out her ID to vote, right? And she was having trouble getting it out of her wallet so that they could see it because she was like 90 something. And when we got back in the car, she's like, yeah, I remember when I had to take that literacy test. And so you think about these Black folk who have lived through Jim Crow and disfranchisement and are living through it again. And again, they're saying, not on my watch. I'm not having this. I'm going to do what it takes. And so that's why I love these organizations that come in and find a way to get folks who don't have a birth certificate, like Vote Riders, works them through to get them the ID that they need to be able to vote. I think that's so important. And this other group, the Georgia Coalition for the People's Agenda, that set up the drives, the rides to and from the polls so that folks could deal with the fact that over 200 polling places have been closed down. And what we know is that for every, 1/10 of a mile that a polling place is moved from the Black community, or is a 1/4 of a mile, Black voter turnout goes down by a certain percentage point up to 4 miles, which can take it a 20% drop. So when you're having these drops, so like in Sparta, Georgia, they moved the polling place from the Black community 17 miles away. In Macon, Georgia, they moved the polling place into the sheriff's office.
Wow. And so I want to say this kind of ties in, I think, what I've gleaned from some of Josh's book, that this is where it comes down to engagement and involvement in the local level, where people can kind of watch. I mean, I know we're all fascinated with what's going on nationally, and that is important too. But I think it's these local things that people need to be aware of and how they can make a difference in laws and things that are changed to suppress voting and access to voting polls and things like that. Am I right, Josh?
Yeah, absolutely. And we don't run one election here. We don't even really run 51 elections. We run about 8,000 elections all at once
Yeah.
in the various counties. I was listening to Carol and Anita and amazed by these stories, and it reminded me of my trip this summer, where I made a pilgrimage to Selma, Alabama. And if people haven't been to Selma, I think every American has an obligation after being there, has an obligation to go and walk over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where John Lewis and the other marchers, walked over and were faced by violence, all for the right to vote. And when we were there, we met an individual, and I pulled up my phone because I want to make sure I get the quote right from him. We met an individual named Sam Walker, who was about, I think you said he was about 11 at the time. And he was there at the march. He and his friends went to school in the morning to check in, and then they went to the march. And he, we chatted, and it was incredible to speak with him about that experience and what the right to vote has meant to him. And then he gave me this quote, which I wrote down, and I'm trying to spread as much as possible. So I think it's so powerful, and it demonstrates that, we're talking about the doom and gloom of voter suppression, which is real, but we all have come back to the good news about what's possible, because that's what motivates us to know that change can occur. And what he said was, and this was from a pastor who was a friend of his, no generation can expect to see the end of struggle, but each generation has a responsibility to advance the struggle. And I thought that was just so telling, right? No generation can expect to see the end of struggle, but each generation has a responsibility to advance the struggle. Now, you asked specifically about, awareness at the local level. We all vote at our local polling place, whether it's at a precinct or, for states where you have absentee balloting and or mail-in balloting, and you drop off your ballot box. It's a very local phenomenon. But what I actually think that we should focus on even more are local voting rules, because we vary so much in how we interact with the ballot box and how we vote. And some states do it really well, and some states do it really poorly. And some locations in various states do it really well, and some locations do it really poorly. But one thing we have seen is that local innovations can spread to other places and make voting better when one place does the right thing and tries out something new and tries out how to make things work. And then other locations see, okay, that's really good, including expansion of the right to vote. The women's suffrage movement was a local initiative before it became within the U.S. Constitution to enfranchise women. There were states that let women vote in local elections or school board elections. That was really important history before we got to the 19th Amendment. It kind of really led to a snowballing effect and led to the 19th Amendment, which enfranchised women. The minority suppression, voter suppression, has been combated at the local level. It's both engaging at the local level, when historically, places in the South, to register to vote, you'd have to tell the registrar how many bubbles there are in a bar of soap, or count how many beans there are in this jar. I actually give my students the Louisiana literacy test. They make them take the Louisiana literacy test, which is impossible for anyone to pass, unless, of course, you're a white male like me and don't have to take it to register. And so I want the students to experience what it's like to have to jump through these hurdles to be able to exercise the right to vote. But at the same time, you have registrars in local places who did the right thing, who actively went out, 50 years ago to register Black individuals, and you have people today who are focused on marginalized communities. Anita mentioned, or Carol rather mentioned, Vote Riders, a similar organization, Spread the Vote, which gets IDs into voters' hands. These local organizations are doing so much to combat the voter suppression. And so you're right, we have to focus on the 8,000 elections we run simultaneously, not just the one national election that gets the most attention.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I love these stories. I didn't know we were going to have so much of stories, but I love them. And I love hearing how you engage your students, because that definitely ties in the youth vote, argument or discussion, because you two, Josh and Carol, are directly engaging with them. But I also like, Anita, how you mentioned that you've also brought in young people to help out with the postcards. And even though they can't vote, this is also a way for them to get into the habit of being aware of what's going on politically and being involved in some way that they can. And then maybe at the point when they're 18 or 16, it won't be, such a stretch to be involved at the point of going in. And hopefully things will be better after what happened in 2020, where we had what was said by an appointee of Trump, no less, that it was actually one of the safest and best elections we saw. And there was so much mail-in ballots because of COVID. I think we want to see a trend. Maybe that will become a trend. I know for myself, it's become a trend. Now I'm like looking for my mail-in ballot, So yeah, I appreciate all these stories that we're hearing. I do want to bring in a couple of questions from the audience, so to speak. Some people submitted questions ahead of time because they knew we were going to be having this discussion. And Zach has one specifically for Josh. He says, your book is so inspiring and you seem optimistic on the subject, which, as we all talked about, is hard to be sometimes. And he's saying for himself personally, it's been really hard in recent years to be engaged because a lot of negativity has come up and because things have become so divisive. And he's just wondering, like, what is the key to stay optimistic, at least to the point where you stay engaged?
That's a great question because, there is so much to be pessimistic about. And don't get me wrong, I'm pessimistic about a lot of this as well. I'm pessimistic that we're refighting battles over who can vote and minority voting and minority representation. And, now we're in this whole era where election deniers are taking hold, where we no longer can accept that the losers are going to recognize that they lost, that, there's no such thing for some people as an election loss. It must have been fraud or some sort of problem. That's not how you can't stand a democracy that way. Part of democracy is the losers accepting defeat. I'm very pessimistic about the Supreme Court and the voting rules that the justices are handing down. So there's a lot to be pessimistic about. But here's my kind of a worldview on this. So we could accept the fact of doom and gloom because there's so much out there, and then, sort of throw up our hands and say, well, there's nothing we can do about it. The system is rigged against us. So, it's easy to just kind of revert into your everyday life. You may have obligations of family and kids have to be to various places. And, it's easy to shut that out because otherwise you're going to wallow in the doom and gloom. And what does that do? It makes our democracy devolve even further. So I've taken a conscious effort to say we need to use the doom and gloom to motivate and sustain us and to look for the good stories. I love people hear all the time about Fred Rogers' quote of, anytime there's a terrible event, look for the helpers, right? Look for the helpers. It's going to demonstrate that there's still good in the world, even at the worst times. And I think that analogy rings true for our elections as well. We have to look for the positive things and latch on to them. We have to look for the Anitas of the world, to demonstrate that change is possible. And so I think there's just two paths. I'm not denying that there's appropriately negativity. There's appropriate negativity about our elections because there's a lot to be pessimistic about. But if we do that and then throw up our hands and say, well, democracy had a good run, then we can expect democracy to end. Really, it's that stark. Instead, if we double down and we double down in the ways that Anita and Carol have been talking about, in ways that try to change things from the ground up and latch on to those good news stories, then we can see that change is possible. And one last point about that. My book, I was extremely careful and purposeful at only talking about reforms that have been enacted somewhere. So, I don't talk much about the Electoral College, and the Electoral College is terrible and we need to get rid of it. And it's all these problems, but I didn't really mention it very much in the book because I can't point to a place that has changed the way they run elections in response to the problems of the Electoral College. And I wanted my book to be something where every reform in there, you can say, okay, that's working here, so maybe it can work there as well. And that's why I think those sorts of things I think you need to latch on to say, if it's working in that place of the country, why can't it work where I'm located as well?
Yeah. And I would add to that, that's just pitch perfect. But I would add to that, when we don't engage, really bad things happen. And so I go back to the 2010 midterm election. That was Obama's first term. And in that 2010 election, you had a lot of liberals who Obama didn't part the Red Sea, he didn't walk on water, and they were just ticked off, and they weren't going to show up at the polls. Well, somebody doggone else showed up at the polls, flipped over half of the state houses, and we ended up now fighting a rear guard action, dealing with extremely partisan gerrymandered districts, dealing with anti-reproductive rights laws, dealing with loosening gun laws so that you don't need training or a license in order to carry concealed. I mean, dealing with erasing the teaching of real American history from our public schools. So we ended up, because we did not engage, we ended up having to fight this rear guard action of reaction. So that's what's at stake. Reaction requires our lack of engagement. When we engage, we begin to get the world that we deserve. And so when we envision what that is, and we engage to fight for it, we engage to vote for it, we engage to write the postcards for it, we engage to figure out, how do I get that absentee ballot and where do I deposit it? When we do that work, that is our engagement. That's our investment in that better future, in that next generation is fighting a different battle than the one that we are fighting. That's what this is about. So that's why we stay engaged. It counts. Voter suppression depends on our going, it's all messed up, it's going to be what it's always going to be. Why bother? Those that's just DC. No. Or that's just Albany, or that's just Atlanta. No. That's just Sacramento. No. We are the people, and we engage, and we make the difference.
And was it John Lewis who said that if the right to vote wasn't so important, then they wouldn't be trying so hard to take it away from you?
Yes.
I love that.
Very good point.
Perfect.
Yes.
True. And you know what? That's a perfect note to end on, to a great discussion. I realize in a lot of ways we only touched the surface of a very important topic, or topics around voting and voter suppression and voter engagement. But I'm glad we at least got this discussion going, and it's going to live on our YouTube channel forever. And I think it's forever going to be relevant. We didn't say anything that's especially dated. It's all going to be relevant, and I really appreciate it. Anita, I want to give you a chance to get some extra help. Is there a place people can go if they want to help out with the postcards at all?
Yes, there's still time. We're going to mail our last postcards on October 24th. So if you go to anitaspeachcorps.club, that's our little webpage. And you can find out everything you need to know, how to get in touch with me, how to donate for stamps, how to order your kit that we can pop in the mail to you that has everything you need in it to get some folks around a table and write some postcards. anitaspeachcorps.club.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all our panelists, including Josh Douglas and Carol Anderson. We have plenty of both their books, which are prominently displayed behind me: Vote for Us, How to Take Back Our Elections and Change the Future of Voting, and One Person, No Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy. I heartily encourage everybody to get these books. They're both in paperback, so they're very affordable and portable and good to pass along to friends and family, future voters and current voters. Thank you so much for participating in the process by helping Book Passage get the word out on these books and these discussions. Please remember that Election Day is coming up, less than 3 weeks away, November 8th, Tuesday, November 8th. And everybody, please get out the vote and get somebody else to get out and vote if you haven't done with your mail-in ballot. And by the way, Georgia has started their early voting. Right now, they're in the midst of early voting, and I'm sure other states. Yeah. So thank you so much for joining us at Book Passage and joining in this discussion. Thank you to our panelists. Until next time, happy voting.